He's finishing up his first full term in the State Assembly, and all Rich Gordon has had to face is 2 budget crises and a vote on high-speed rail. He's here to talk about what he's learned in Sacramento. The game is politics, and the game is on. I'm Mark Simon. After 13 years on the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors, Rich Gordon was elected to the State Assembly in 2010, representing the peninsula and Silicon Valley. He wrote in an op-ed that he thought he knew what to expect when he went to Sacramento, but it turns out he was a little surprised. Rich, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I got to ask you, it wasn't what you expected when you first got up there, and I wonder if it still isn't quite what you expected.
It's a very interesting place in so many ways.
Interesting is such an interesting word, isn't
it? Well, yeah. I think, several things I didn't expect. I knew there was partisanship. I don't think I expected it to be as severe as it is. I knew that, there was a lot of work on legislation. I didn't realize that you deal with about 3,000 bills every 2 years. I don't really think I understood the workload or the work pace. And then finally, I don't think I understood kind of the fact that Sacramento is a kind of an insular world. Mm-hmm. When I'm there, I'm dealing with a small group of people and often disconnected from the rest of the state in many ways.
Is it better or worse than you thought, or is it a combination of the two?
It's a combination of the two. I mean, I have to say, initially, in the first few months, it was kind of like, oh my Lord, what have I done? Be careful what you ask for. But I think I've found my pace. I've found my niche. I think that I figured out how to be successful for my constituents and for California. So it's growing on me, and I'm enjoying it.
The public's view of the legislature is not good. It's an all-time low. It's actually lower than journalists, which is a sad commentary on our state of affairs. But what can be done to improve it, to improve the reputation? Are there changes within the structure of the legislature and how it does its business? And or does it require almost a wholesale change of attitude?
Well, I think there's several things. One is that I think there are changes that can be made by the legislature. One, I think greater transparency. I think that having legislation in print for longer periods of time, greater opportunity for people to examine what we're doing, more opportunities for public input would be helpful. I think it would be better, candidly, if we had a tighter limit on the amount of legislation that could be introduced, so we do fewer bills. I'd rather see more quality than quantity when it comes to legislation. I don't know how many more laws California needs.
One of the ballot measures in the November election is a reform that would structurally affect the legislature, which is a 2-year budgeting cycle. Is that something you think is a good idea? I
do. I actually support a whole host of budget reforms that I'd like to see. Mm-hmm. I do believe in a 2-year budget cycle. I think forcing the state to think longer term is better. And in those states that do a 2-year budget cycle, in the second year, when you're not working on the budget, you actually have the time to go in and review programs, get into what the activities are in the agencies and functions of state government. I think that's important. That's also why, as part of a budget reform, I would support performance-based budgeting. I think we need to be able to say, here's what we expect you to do with the tax dollar, and hold the state agencies accountable to that. That way, I can come back to the public and say, look, I know how your tax dollar is being spent.
You're on the Budget Committee. You're making it sound as though the budget, the annual decision about how to pass the budget, it dominates the agenda, that it's basically everything else derives itself from there. But isn't that the way it's supposed to be?
Well, it is supposed to be. I mean, the budget is the highest statement of our values. It really describes what we think is most important for California, because that's where we put our resources, our tax dollars. So it ought to be a thoughtful process. It ought to be a process that is deliberative. And it ought to be a process that takes up time. It's not something you should do quickly, lightly, and conveniently.
In the introduction, I talked about the vote on high-speed rail, and before we plunge into that subject, I should disclose that I work for Caltrain in my day job. But a lot of people are characterizing some of those votes as political courage. Was a no vote a political courage vote, or was a yes vote a politically courageous vote?
You know, I have to say, I think each of us comes to our votes in our own way, and whatever vote you take, when you take it as a vote of courage, because whatever I do as a member of the legislature, I'm going to upset a certain group of people. Not everybody is unanimous in what we ought to be doing in California.
That always comes as a surprise to some elected officials, I think.
Well, I learned that early on.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not, my effort is not to please the majority. My effort is to try to faithfully represent my constituents and do what I think is best for the region I represent. And keeping that in mind, I was very comfortable with my vote on what we did relative to high-speed rail, because I think we did a great job for the peninsula.
Explain why you voted for it.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand, you know, what it was that we voted on.
For, yeah.
And what we voted for was to provide the funding, finally, to electrify Caltrain. Secondly, we provided a similar amount of funding to modernize rail service in the LA Basin. We voted on a set of transit projects that assist public transit agencies across the state through what was called the Connectivity Fund. And then finally, we voted to provide funding for a segment in the Central Valley, which I came to the conclusion actually has some utility and improves service, Amtrak service in that region. And perhaps most importantly, as part of the legislation, we guaranteed that the blended approach where high-speed rail and Caltrain share track, work together, cooperate, is the path forward on the peninsula.
Yeah. You mentioned first the Central Valley. A lot of people have characterized that as a train to nowhere. Why do you think it has utility? Because it actually upgrades Amtrak service? Is that the only reason?
No, I think there's a couple reasons. One is that that is one of the busiest, the segment between Bakersfield and Sacramento is one of the busiest Amtrak service segments in the entire United States. And it is severely incapacitated by having to share track with freight in a very busy freight zone. Mm-hmm. So building a separate track for passenger that Amtrak will use until high-speed rail someday is available will actually allow for an increase in passenger service in that region. And it also will allow for an increase in freight service in the region. And the more trucks we can get off of Highway 99 and Highway 5 by using freight rail instead, it also benefits that region. And it benefits in terms of its air quality. So I just felt that there were a whole host of things that actually made that a project that had utility.
We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.